The day Beatrice Holloway stepped off that wagon, 40 men looked at her and saw nothing worth remembering. They saw a heavy woman, a widow with worn boots and a battered suitcase and knees that ached before noon. They saw someone who would be gone by the first frost, driven out by the cold or the work or the sheer indifference of men who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. The foreman crossed his arms and smiled the smile of a man who has already written the ending. He was wrong. What those 40 men could not see, what Clint Rourke, with all his years of authority and all his careful cruelty, never once understood, was that the woman standing in that Montana dust had already survived things that would have broken every single one of them. She had buried a husband, lost a home, rebuilt herself from nothing in railroad camps and boarding houses and every kind of hard place the frontier had to offer. She had learned to keep records when no one was watching, to stand still when other people ran, and to walk into a trap with a lantern in her hand because she had done the math and decided that courage was the only calculation that mattered. They thought she was the easiest person on that ranch to destroy. She was the last one standing. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and stay with me until the very last word. Because what happens at Black Ridge Ranch is something none of them saw coming, and neither will you. The wagon hit another rut in the road, and Beatrice Holloway grabbed the splintered sideboard with both hands to keep herself from sliding off the bench entirely. "Sorry, ma'am," the driver muttered, not sounding sorry at all. She didn't answer. She was too busy watching the land open up before her. Vast, indifferent, impossibly wide. Montana in September smelled like cut hay and coming cold, and the sky above the rolling grasslands was the particular shade of gray that warned a person, winter remembers where you live. Out here, there was no softness to anything. Not the ground, not the wind, not the men who worked it. Beatrice Holloway had buried a husband in Ohio 3 years ago. She had buried her pride not long after that, when the last of his debts came due, and the house she'd kept for 19 years was signed away with a banker's fountain pen. She had spent the years since then doing what she had always done best, cooking. In boarding houses, in railroad camps, in the back kitchens of hotels that didn't ask too many questions about a widow traveling alone. She was 41 years old, her knees ached in the mornings, and she had learned a long time ago that the world was not in the habit of being gentle with women who looked like her. She knew what she looked like. She had always known. Full-figured was the polite word. Heavy was the common one. The men at the railroad camps had used others. She had learned to let those words move through her like wind through a fence, present for a moment, then gone, leaving nothing behind but the work still waiting to be done. The wagon crested a rise and Black Ridge Ranch spread out below her. It was larger than she'd imagined from the advertisement. The main barn stood 3 stories high, weathered red paint fading to the color of old blood. A long bunkhouse ran parallel to a stable, and beyond both, set on slightly higher ground as if surveying its own domain, sat the ranch house, dark-windowed, shuttered, and quiet in a way that seemed less like peace and more like grief. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, thin and gray. Somewhere below, cattle moved like a slow brown river between the fence lines. "That's the cookhouse there," the driver said, nodding toward a low building behind the main barn. "They'll want supper by 5. "What time is it now?" He squinted at the sun. "Little past 2. Beatrice nodded once and tightened her grip on her battered suitcase. 3 hours. She could work with 3 hours. The wagon had barely rolled to a stop before the first voice reached her. "Well," a pause heavy with contempt. "That's what they sent us." She climbed down from the wagon without help, her boots finding the hard-packed earth of the yard, and she turned to face the man who'd spoken. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, one boot propped on the bottom rail of the paddock fence, and he wore authority the way some men wore Sunday hats, like he'd borrowed it from someone else and never given it back. Clint Rourke, foreman of Black Ridge Ranch. The man who'd placed the hiring advertisement in 3 different newspapers and interviewed exactly no one before the agency sent her name. He was somewhere in his late 40s, lean in the way that cold climates and hard tempers make men lean, with a jaw like the edge of a hatchet and eyes the color of creek water after a storm, gray-brown and unreadable. He looked at Beatrice the way you looked at a wagon wheel that didn't quite fit the axle. Not with anger exactly, just the flat certainty of a problem already presenting itself. Beatrice Holloway, she said, because she had learned that the first thing you did was say your own name, clearly and without apology, before anyone else had the chance to replace it with something else. So I see. Clint pushed off the fence and walked a slow half-circle around her, not bothering to disguise what he was doing. Behind him, a handful of ranch hands who'd drifted near enough to watch had the decency to look at their boots. Most of them, anyway. Agency tell you what this job involves? Because frontier cooking isn't the same as feeding boarding house guests, Mrs. Holloway. We run 40 men on this spread, 3 meals a day, no exceptions, starting before sunup. I'm aware. Physical work. Hauling, lifting, managing stores across a kitchen that doesn't have the comforts you might be accustomed to. Mr. Rourke, her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was a trick she'd taught herself. Quiet lands harder than loud, if you know how to use it. I've cooked in railroad camps in February and cattle drives in July. I've managed kitchens for 60 men at a time with one assistant and a stove that wasn't level. What you're describing sounds like a fine Tuesday morning. Something moved behind Clint's eyes. Not respect, not yet, maybe not ever, but a recalculation, like a man who'd expected to clear a fence and found it 6 inches higher than he'd measured. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. We'll see, he said. She was shown to a small cabin at the far edge of the cookhouse building, separate from the bunkhouse, which was the one thing in the setup she found genuinely thoughtful, though she doubted Clint Rourke had thought of it. The cabin held a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window facing the eastern hills. The door had a handle, but no lock. Beatrice set her suitcase on the bed and stood very still for a moment, doing the arithmetic of the situation. A woman alone. 40 men. A foreman who had already decided what she was worth. A door with no lock. She unpacked without making anything of it. She was good at not making things of things. It was one of the more exhausting skills she'd developed. She found the cookhouse and took inventory, moving through the pantry with the focused calm of a general surveying terrain before a battle. Flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples. Adequate. Coffee. Not enough, but she could stretch it. Butter? Nearly gone. She found a ledger on the shelf above the window and opened it. The last entries were 2 weeks old and written in a hand so careless the numbers barely resolved into anything useful. She took a fresh page, dipped the pen, and began recording what she actually found. Every pound of flour, every slab of bacon, every tin of lard. She had always kept records, not because anyone told her to, but because records were armor. In a world that was quick to blame women for losses they didn't cause, numbers were the only language that couldn't be talked around. She was deep in the pantry when she heard footsteps outside. Not the heavy boot stomp of most ranch hands, but something quieter, more deliberate. She stayed where she was. A few minutes later, when she came back out to the main kitchen, she found the door to her cabin standing open. She crossed the yard and stopped in the doorway. A man was crouched at the doorframe, working carefully with a hand drill and a small steel mechanism that she recognized after a moment's confusion as a lock, a proper deadbolt lock, the kind fitted to a solid door. He was not a tall man, nor a broad one. His frame suggested strength without showing off about it, the kind that came from years of consistent labor rather than pride. His hair was dark and cut short under a plain gray hat. His clothes were clean but worn past any pretense of newness. He heard her and looked up. His eyes were dark and calm, the way deep water is calm, in that way that makes you wonder how far down it goes. He held her gaze without apology or embarrassment, and without the particular flicker of assessment that most men's eyes did when they looked at her. He simply looked, as if she were a person, and that was all there was to it. "Lock," he said, as if that explained everything. "I can see that," Beatrice said. Door didn't have one. He turned back to his work, fitting the mechanism into the mortise he'd cut with the quiet precision of someone who had done this before. "Should have one. Did Clint Rourke ask you to do this?" A pause. "No." "Did anyone?" Another pause, shorter. "No." She watched him work for a moment. "What's your name?" "Elias." He fitted the striker plate, tested the action once, then stood and handed her 2 small brass keys without ceremony. "Thorne." She took the keys. They were warm from his palm. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Elias is fine. He picked up his tools and walked back toward the barn without another word, his boots quiet in the dust, his back straight without being stiff, like a man who had no need to perform anything for anyone. Beatrice stood in her doorway with two brass keys in her hand and looked after him for a long moment. She had been to a lot of places in 3 years. No one had ever put a lock on her door before she asked. Supper that first evening was biscuits, salt pork gravy, boiled beans, and a dried apple cobbler that she'd pulled together from what she could find. Not the meal she would have planned with proper stores and proper time, but honest food, hot and plentiful, and made with the kind of care you can't fake, because hungry people taste the difference. The men came in loud and sat down louder. 40 ranch hands filling a long plank table in a low-ceilinged room had a sound like a small weather event. Beatrice served from the kitchen end, refilling without being asked, moving between the stove and the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years learning to read a room's hunger. Nobody said thank you, but most of them ate 2 helpings, and a few of them ate 3, and the table fell quiet in the particular way it does when food is earning its own respect. Clint sat at the head of the table. He ate without comment, his eyes traveling occasionally to Beatrice in the kind of way that wasn't quite watching and wasn't quite not watching. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood up. "Not bad for a first night," he said, pitching his voice to Carrie. "We'll see how long before the novelty wears off." A few men laughed. Beatrice was already carrying a stack of plates back to the kitchen, and she didn't turn around. She noticed, when the room began to clear out, that Elias Thorne wasn't there. She had scanned the table twice without finding him. She asked one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 19 with a sunburned nose, where the quiet man sat. The boy shrugged. "Elias? He eats after. Always has, whatever's left." "Whatever's left," she repeated. "Yeah." The boy looked vaguely uncomfortable, as if he'd just said something that sounded worse out loud than it did in his head. "He's just—" He trailed off and went out the door. Beatrice stood at the stove and looked at the pot she'd set aside, still warm, still half full, biscuits in the cloth beside it. And she thought about what it meant to always arrive last to a table where you weren't quite invited, always eating the remnants of other people's fill. She thought she understood that particular kind of hunger better than most. When Elias came to the back door of the cookhouse 20 minutes later, she had a full plate waiting and a cup of coffee that was still hot. She set them on the work table without a word. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it, as if he had prepared for a world without this particular kindness and was quietly revising his calculations. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to her washing up. He sat down at the work table and ate. He didn't make conversation, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have both spent enough time in the noise of other people's opinions that quiet feels less like absence and more like rest. When he was done, he brought the plate and cup to the wash basin, rinsed them himself, and set them on the drying board. "Cobbler was good," he said. "Dried apples," she replied. "Better fresh." "Most things are," he said, and went out into the dark. She lay in her bunk that night and listened to the wind move across the Montana plain, that long, unbroken sound like the land itself breathing. Her knees ached the way they always did after a day of standing, a dull, deep ache she had learned to regard as information rather than complaint. She would need to find a stool for the kitchen. She would need more coffee. She would need to speak to whoever managed the stores about the butter situation. She turned the 2 brass keys over in her fingers in the dark. Outside, the wind found every gap in the cabin walls and tested them, one by one, the way certain kinds of people do when they've decided you don't belong somewhere. Beatrice Holloway had been tested by a great many winds in her life. She had always been good at finding the gaps they couldn't get through. She set the keys on the washstand, pulled the blanket to her chin, and slept. In the morning, she rose before the stars had finished their business with the sky, and she lit the cookhouse stove and began to work, the way she had always worked, the way she intended to keep working, steadily, carefully, with both hands, and without waiting for anyone's permission. The Montana frontier was cold and wide, and without mercy, and she was exactly where she meant to be. She didn't know yet what was being stolen in the dark. She didn't know what was being hidden, or who was hiding it, or what they would do when they realized she was the kind of woman who kept records of everything. She only knew what the morning required, and she gave it that, and for now, that was enough. The second week at Black Ridge Ranch arrived with frost on the window panes and a sourness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Beatrice felt it before she understood it, the way certain rooms change temperature not from cold, but from the people inside them. The ranch hands had settled into a routine of tolerating her presence the way men tolerate a change they didn't vote for, without open protest, but without any warmth either. They ate what she put in front of them, and they ate it hungrily, and not one of them thought to consider that the hunger they satisfied 3 times a day was being managed by a woman who rose 2 hours before they did and went to bed 2 hours after. She had established her rhythm quickly because rhythm was survival. 4:30 in the morning, the stove. 5 o'clock, the biscuits in. 5:30, the bacon in the iron pan, the coffee on the boil, the oats stirring. By the time the bunkhouse door opened and the first men stumbled into the gray Montana dawn, the cookhouse was warm and the table was set and the food was ready. She did not take pride in this the way some people take pride in extraordinary things. She took pride in it the way a craftsman takes pride in a well-joined corner, quietly, in private, because the work itself was its own testimony. What she had not anticipated was how much the work would cost her body. Her knees had always been honest with her, and they were honest now. This was harder than the railroad camps, harder than the boarding houses. The cookhouse floor was uneven stone, and standing on it for 12 hours sent a particular kind of ache up through her ankles and into her hips that she had learned to breathe through rather than mention. She had found a 3-legged stool and positioned it near the work table, sitting when she could, standing when she had to. Some mornings she gripped the edge of the cast-iron stove just to steady herself while the feeling came back into her feet. She never did it where anyone could see. One morning, near the end of the second week, she was hauling a full pot of water from the well to the kitchen, both hands on the bucket handle, arms burning, moving steadily if not quickly across the frozen yard, when she heard it. Lord Almighty. The voice belonged to a ranch hand named Decker, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a red beard and the particular self-satisfaction of someone who had never been seriously challenged by anything. He was standing at the paddock fence with 2 other men watching her. "You see that? Surprised the ground don't crack under her." The other 2 laughed, the way men laugh when someone else does the cruelty and they only have to applaud it. Beatrice did not slow down. She did not look at them. She carried the water to the kitchen door, set it down, picked up the next empty bucket, and went back to the well. "Hey, Mrs. Holloway!" Decker's voice carried across the yard with the ease of a man who had never once worried about being heard. "You sure you don't need help? Might take 2 trips for a woman you're—" Decker. The voice came from the direction of the barn, quiet and flat, the way a closed door is flat. Elias Thorne stood in the barn doorway, one hand resting on the frame, not looking at Decker with any particular intensity, just looking in that level, unhurried way he had. He didn't add anything to the name. He didn't have to. Decker's laugh died in his throat. He turned back to the fence and said something to the man beside him in a lower voice. And the group drifted away with the casual ease of people pretending they hadn't just been made to feel small. Beatrice filled her second bucket and carried it back across the yard. As she passed the barn, Elias fell into step beside her without asking, took the bucket from her hand with the same matter-of-fact calm with which he'd installed her lock, and carried it to the kitchen door. "I can manage," she said. "I know you can," he said, and set the bucket down and went back to the barn. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and she thought, not for the first time, that Elias Thorne was one of the stranger men she had ever encountered, in the best possible sense of the word strange. He was not easy to read, which was itself unusual. Most people in Beatrice's experience were fairly legible if you paid attention. Loneliness looked a certain way. Anger looked a certain way. Ambition had its own posture. But Elias moved through the ranch with a quality she couldn't quite name, a kind of watchful stillness, like a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and no more, who had decided at some point that observation was more useful than announcement. He was always the last to the table and always the first to finish any task assigned to him. He didn't drink with the other hands in the evenings. He didn't play cards. He spent his spare time, what little of it there was, in the barn, or walking the fence lines alone in the late afternoon light, or sitting on the step outside his bunk with a small notebook that he opened and closed without anyone getting close enough to see what was inside. She had started saving him a full plate every evening without either of them making a point of it. He came to the back door after the others had cleared out, ate at the work table, rinsed his own dishes, and left. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both kinds of evening felt complete in their own way. "Can I ask you something?" she said one night, maybe 3 weeks in. She was kneading the next morning's bread dough, and he was finishing a plate of beans and cornbread, and the cookhouse was warm and lamplit and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "You can ask," he said, which was not quite the same as yes, but close enough. "Why do you always eat last?" He considered this for a moment, the way he considered everything, not because he didn't know the answer she'd come to realize, but because he believed answers deserved the same care as the questions that made them necessary. "Because there's always enough," he said finally, "and if there isn't, I'd rather be the one who goes without." Beatrice worked the dough in silence for a moment. "That's a lonely way to live." "Most honest ways are," he said, and took a sip of his coffee. She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she asked, "Where were you before here?" "East," he said. "Then west? Then here." "That's not much of an answer." "No?" he agreed pleasantly, and finished his cornbread. She smiled in spite of herself, which was something she hadn't done in front of another person in a long time. It felt unfamiliar, like putting weight on a foot that had been asleep. The trouble with the supplies announced itself on a Thursday, which was the day Beatrice went to the pantry to pull 2 new sacks of flour she had logged, as delivered the previous Monday. They weren't there. She stood in the pantry doorway and looked at the shelf where they should have been, and then she looked at her ledger, and then she looked at the shelf again. 20 pounds of flour. Entered, dated, initialed by the supply driver whose name she'd made sure to record. Gone. She didn't mention it. Not then. She made a note in her ledger and kept working, adjusting the week's meals with the quiet flexibility of a woman used to making something from less than she'd planned on. But she watched more carefully after that. She counted. She recorded. She dated every entry with the same methodical precision she had brought to the pantry on her very first day, and she began to notice a pattern that made something cold settle in her stomach. Food was disappearing, not dramatically, not whole crates emptied overnight, but steadily, in amounts small enough that a person who wasn't keeping careful records would simply assume they'd miscounted. A quarter sack of salt pork here, a tin of lard there, coffee, beans, dried apples in quantities that accumulated, over 3 weeks, into something that could only be described as systematic. Someone was taking from the stores. Carefully. Consistently. And in a way that had been invisible, she suspected, because no one before her had bothered to write anything down. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before Clint Rourke came to find it for her. He appeared in the cookhouse doorway on a Saturday afternoon when the kitchen was quiet, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and that particular expression of his that was arranged to look reasonable and wasn't. "I need to talk to you about the stores," he said. "All right," she said. She was making pie crust and she kept her hands in the flour. "We're running short on several items," he said. "Flour, coffee, pork. I'm going to need you to account for where it's gone." She looked up from the pastry board then, and she held his gaze with the steadiness she'd been practicing since the first day she'd arrived. "I have accounts," she said. "I've been keeping them since the day I got here." Something moved in Clint's eyes, fast, and then carefully still. "That a fact?" "Everything that's come in through that door is in my ledger," she said, keeping her voice even. "Dated, weighed, initialed by the delivery drivers. You're welcome to look at it any time you like." The pause that followed was small but significant. The pause of a man who has just discovered that the board he was planning to step on has more give in it than he expected. "I'm sure your records are fine," he said, and his smile rearranged itself back into place. "Just making sure we're keeping track is all. New cook, new systems, takes time to—" "Mr. Rourke," her voice was still quiet, still even. "I've kept every record since the day I arrived. The shortages you're describing don't match what my ledger shows came through that door. If there's a discrepancy, I'd be glad to sit down and compare figures." He looked at her for a long moment, that gray-brown gaze, flat and unreadable. "We'll sort it out," he said, and left. Beatrice stood at her pastry board and breathed in and breathed out, her flowery hands still and careful on the marble. She had been around enough dangerous men to recognize the particular quality of danger that wore a polite face. It was not the easiest kind to defend against, because it moved slowly and smiled while it moved. That evening, when Elias came to the back door, she told him what had happened. Not because she was frightened, or not only because of that, but because she had come to believe, in the quiet, pragmatic way she believed most things, that Elias Thorne saw more of what happened on this ranch than anyone gave him credit for, and that his opinion might be worth having. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He let her finish. Then he looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then he said, "How far back do your records go?" "Since the day I arrived," she said, "September 8th. "And before that?" "The ledger that was here before me is a mess. Half the entries are illegible. The other half don't add up." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "Keep your records," he said. "Keep them somewhere safe, not just in the pantry." She looked at him. "You know something." It was not quite a question. He met her eyes and held them for a moment that felt longer than it was, and she had the sense, not for the first time, of looking at still water and understanding suddenly that it was very deep. "I know enough," he said, "to tell you to be careful." "Of Clint?" "Of the situation," he said, with the precise care of a man who had learned to distinguish between the two. Then, as if that thread of conversation was now complete, he picked up his cup. "Cobbler tonight?" "Peach preserves," she said. "Not as good as real." "Better than none," he said, and she served him dessert, and they did not speak of Clint Rourke again that evening. But she took his advice. The next morning, she made a clean copy of every entry in her ledger from September 8th forward, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the lining of her winter coat, which hung on the peg inside her locked cabin door. The whispers started the week after that. She heard them the way you hear things in a place where the walls are thin and the wind carries. In fragments, in the particular silence that follows a conversation when you walk into a room. She caught words. Shortage, missing, her fault, probably. How would she know? Look at her. She caught glances exchanged across the supper table. She caught the way two of the younger ranch hands, boys who had always been polite enough, started leaving meals without looking at her. Clint was careful about it. He never said anything directly. He simply began raising the question of the missing stores in the general hearing of the men, phrased always as a puzzle, a concern, a thing he was troubled by and couldn't quite account for. He didn't point at Beatrice. He didn't have to. She was the newest person on the ranch. She was the one with access to the pantry. She was the one who was, his tone always implied this without saying it, not quite what Black Ridge Ranch needed. Not quite enough of the right things, and rather too much of the wrong ones. It was Decker who finally said it out loud, because Decker was the kind of man who said what other people only thought, and considered this a virtue. It was a Sunday, after supper, and Beatrice was washing up in the kitchen when she heard his voice carry through the open window. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Decker announced to whoever was smoking with him on the bench outside. "New cook shows up. Supplies start disappearing. You do the math." "That's not fair," said another voice, younger, less certain, one of the newer hands. "She works harder than anyone I've seen." "Don't mean she's honest," Decker said. "Women like that, heavy women, widows, no family, no one checking on her, they got a way of taking what they need and making it look like nothing." Beatrice stood at the wash basin and was very still for a moment. The water was getting cold around her hands. Outside, the cigarette smoke drifted past the window. She finished washing the dishes. She dried her hands. She banked the stove for the night. She took her apron off, folded it, and hung it on its hook. She did all of this with perfect deliberate care, the way you do things when you are determined not to let anyone see what is happening inside you. Then she went to her cabin, unlocked her door with her brass key, and sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark. She was not, she told herself, going to cry. She was too tired to cry, for one thing. And she had cried in railroad camps and boarding houses and in the kitchen of the house she'd lost, and it had never once changed the arithmetic of the situation. What changed things was work. What changed things was being more careful and more precise and more thorough than anyone expected, until the evidence was so clear that even the people who wanted to misread it couldn't manage it. She had her ledger, she had her copy. She sat in the dark and breathed until the tightness in her chest eased, and then she thought about the morning. Biscuits, bacon, gravy, maybe flapjacks. The men responded well to flapjacks, and she needed the goodwill, and flapjacks cost her a little extra labor in the morning that she could absorb if she got up at 4 instead of 4:30. She was working out the logistics of this when a soft sound at the cabin door stopped her. Not a knock, something quieter. She went to the door and listened. Silence. Then, from the ground near the step, the sound of something being set down carefully. She opened the door. Elias stood back a few feet from the step, hands in his coat pockets, not making anything of the fact that it was 10 o'clock at night and he had clearly walked across the dark yard specifically to stand outside her cabin. On the step sat a small bundle of dry split kindling, the good dry kind that lit fast and didn't smoke. "Morning's going to be cold," he said. "Thought you might want that for your stove." She looked at the kindling. She looked at him. In the dark, with only the distant light from the bunkhouse windows to see by, his face was mostly shadow, but his expression, what she could read of it, held that same quality it always did, steady, direct, asking nothing back. "I heard Decker," he said simply. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "it isn't true," not, "don't worry." Just those 3 words, quiet and factual, acknowledging what she hadn't said. "So did half the ranch, probably," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She waited. He didn't add anything else, and after a moment she understood that he wasn't going to, that he had come not to fix anything or explain anything, but only to make sure she knew that someone had heard it and thought it mattered. That was the whole of it. It was, she thought, one of the most decent things anyone had done for her in years. "Flapjacks tomorrow," she said, "in case anyone asks." Something almost smiled at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. "Night, Mrs. Holloway." "Beatrice," she said, and it was the first time she'd offered it. He nodded once, small, careful, like a man receiving something he intended to keep. "Good night, Beatrice." He walked back across the dark yard, and she listened to his quiet footsteps until they were gone, and she stood in her doorway for a while longer with the cold air on her face before she went inside and locked her door and lay down and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. The records were safe in her coat lining. The lock was on her door. The kindling was by her stove. She was still in the fight. In the morning she rose at 4, lit the fire with the good dry wood that burned clean and fast, and by the time the first frost blue light appeared over the eastern hills, the cookhouse was warm and the batter was ready and the griddle was hot, and the smell of flapjacks and good coffee moved across Black Ridge Ranch like a declaration. Whatever Clint Rourke was building in the dark, she was still standing in the light, and she intended to keep standing there until someone made her stop. And she had come to believe, with a quiet certainty that lived somewhere behind her sternum, that making her stop was going to be considerably harder than anyone on this ranch had yet understood. The invitation came on a Wednesday. That was how Beatrice would remember it afterward. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as an invitation, which was the particular genius of Clint Rourke's cruelty. He had a talent for making the dangerous thing seem like the reasonable thing, for wrapping a closed fist in the language of courtesy until you were already inside the room before you understood what the room was. It had been 5 weeks since her arrival, and the mood at Black Ridge Ranch had settled into something that Beatrice could only describe as a held breath. The whispers about the missing supplies had not stopped, but they had changed quality. Less speculative now, more deliberate, shaped by a foreman who knew exactly how to steer a rumor the way a drover steers cattle, with small pressures applied at precisely the right moments. Clint never accused her directly. He was far too careful for that. But twice in the past week he had raised the subject of the inventory in the hearing of several ranch hands, his voice carrying that particular tone of regretful concern that said, without saying, "I'm trying to protect everyone, including her, but the numbers don't lie." The numbers absolutely lied. Beatrice knew exactly what the numbers said because she had written them all down herself. She had added a second copy of her records to the first, a third, in fact, written in a smaller hand on thinner paper and tucked into the toe of a boot she didn't wear in the kitchen. She did not mention this to anyone, including Elias. Some forms of protection were better kept private, held quietly in reserve, like the last coin sewn into a hem. Elias had noticed the change in her, though. She could tell by the way he watched her in the evenings, not intrusively, never that, but with a quality of attention that was different from his usual steadiness, more alert, like a man who has heard a sound he hasn't identified yet and is waiting to understand what made it. "You're being careful," he said one evening. It was not a question. "Always," she said. "More careful than usual," he said. She looked at him across the work table, at the dark, patient eyes and the straight, quiet line of his shoulders, and she thought, as she had thought more than once, that there was something about Elias Thorne that didn't quite fit the shape of the life he appeared to be living. Something in the way he moved through the ranch with the calm authority of a man who owned the ground under his feet, even while performing the labor of a man who owned nothing. It was a contradiction she had filed away without pressing on it, the way you file away a loose floorboard, noted, respected, left alone until the time came to understand it. "Clint is building something," she said. "I can feel it." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He's been building it longer than you've been here," he said. "You just walked into the middle of it." "How long have you known?" Another pause, the kind that held more information than silence usually carried. "Long enough," he said, and she understood, with the particular intelligence that comes from paying close attention to people over time, that this was not evasion. It was precision. He was telling her exactly as much as he had decided she needed to know, right now, and no more. And there was a reason for that, even if she couldn't yet see its shape. She let it rest. She had learned when to push and when to wait, and with Elias Thorne, waiting always produced more than pressing. The following Wednesday, Clint found her after the midday meal, when the hands had gone back to their work and the cookhouse was briefly quiet. He leaned in the doorway with his hat in his hands, a gesture of deliberate deference that didn't suit him, and told her there was a problem with the springhouse. "Springhouse?" she repeated. "Out past the north pasture." He gestured vaguely in a direction that meant nothing specific to her. "Stores some of the ranch's preserved goods. Cold storage, out of the way. I'd like you to take a look at the inventory. Compare it to your ledger, actually, so we can get ahead of this discrepancy situation once and for all." He paused, and the pause had a shape to it. Reasonable, cooperative, nothing to object to. "Be a good chance to clear your name, if you'll pardon my saying so. Some of the men have been talking, and I think a full accounting would settle it." Beatrice looked at him steadily. Every instinct she had, instincts honed over 41 years of watching people do the polite version of unkind things, was ringing like a struck bell. But she had also learned that refusing the obvious move only worked if you had a better move ready, and she wasn't sure yet that she did. "When?" she said. "This afternoon, 2:00. I'll show you the way. It's not a path you'd know yet." He left her standing in the cookhouse with the sound of his boots crossing the yard, and she stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the work table, thinking. She thought about the missing supplies. She thought about the ledger in her coat and the copy in her boot. She thought about the springhouse, out past the north pasture, away from the main buildings, out of sight. She thought about the particular confidence in Clint's voice when he'd said "clear your name," as if he were offering her something and not taking something away. She thought about Elias. She went to find him. He was in the barn, working a harness that needed mending, and he looked up when she came in and read something in her face that made him set the harness down. She told him about the springhouse, quickly and precisely, the way she told him everything. No flourishes, no hedging, just the facts in the order they happened. When she finished, the barn was very quiet except for the soft movement of horses in the stalls. "Don't go," he said. "If I don't go, he'll use that too," she said. "I refused to cooperate. I had something to hide. You see how that works?" His jaw tightened fractionally, the most visible display of emotion she had seen from him since the day they met. "Then I'll come with you." "He invited only me." She watched his face. "If you come, he'll know something changed. He'll adjust." "Beatrice." "Elias." She said his name the way he'd said hers once. Quiet, direct, with the full weight of meaning behind it. "I'm not walking in blind. I know what the room probably is. Knowing what the room is gives you an advantage, even if it's not a comfortable one." She paused. "But I need you to know where I'm going, and I need you to come, just not with me." He looked at her for a long moment, that deep water gaze doing its slow, patient work of seeing. Then he said, How long before I come looking? If I'm not back in an hour, she said, come quickly. He nodded once, and then, with the quiet decisiveness that she had come to recognize as his particular form of urgency, he said, there's a hollow oak at the north pasture fence line, east side. You'll pass it on the way. If something's wrong before you reach the spring house, if anything feels wrong, stop there. And then? I'll be in the tree line, he said. I'll see you. She looked at him. This quiet, strange, careful man who had put a lock on her door without being asked and brought her dry wood in the dark, and said, I heard Decker with such plain, honest weight that it had held her together on a night when she was close to coming apart. She thought, not for the first time, that there was a great deal more to Elias Thorne than anyone on this ranch had been allowed to see. All right, she said, 1 hour. She walked back to the cookhouse and retrieved the largest lantern from the kitchen shelf. Heavy iron, a full reservoir of oil, and at 2 o'clock she crossed the yard and followed Clint Rourke north through the pasture and into the cold afternoon. The walk was 20 minutes across ground that grew rougher the further they got from the main buildings, the grasses going from grazed short to knee-high, the fence lines giving way to open range. The sky had gone the color of pewter, and the wind had a serious quality to it, the kind that meant business. She noted the hollow oak on the east fence line as she passed it, ancient, split at the crown, its shadow long and dark against the pale grass. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite calm, but was close enough to function as calm, which was all she needed. The spring house was a low stone structure half sunk into a hillside, its door facing away from the prevailing wind. It was the kind of building that had been built to be inconspicuous, and it succeeded. Surrounded by brush on 3 sides, accessible by a single dirt track that turned off the main path, you would not find it by accident. You would only find it if someone showed you, or if you were already looking. Clint pushed the door open and stood aside to let her pass, with the courtesy of a man who has arranged the furniture to his advantage. The interior was dim and cold, the stone walls beaded with moisture, the smell of the place earthy and mineral and close. Shelves lined the walls, and on those shelves sat stacked supplies, and the sight of them made everything Beatrice had suspected in the past 3 weeks crystallize into sudden, sharp certainty. 2 flour sacks, a crate of salt pork, tins of lard stacked 4 high, coffee, 3 full bags of it, beans, dried apples, all of it neatly arranged, all of it bearing the same supply house marks she had been recording in her ledger since September 8th. The missing inventory, all of it, right here, every pound, every tin, every sack that had vanished from her pantry records. Someone had been systematically moving supplies from the main stores to this remote outbuilding, and the only question, one that she already understood the answer to, was who had signed the transfer records. No one, because there were no transfer records, because the disappearance had been designed to look like loss, like waste, like the careless incompetence of a new cook who couldn't manage a pantry. Designed to look like her. She heard the door close behind her. There it is, Clint said. His voice had changed. The reasonable courtesy was gone, and what replaced it was something harder and more honest, in the way that a thing stripped of pretense is always, in its way, more honest. Every bit of it. Been sitting here 3 weeks, waiting for someone to find it. Beatrice turned to face him. She kept the lantern at her side, its weight familiar and solid in her hand. You moved it, she said. Not a question, not an accusation either, just a statement of what was plainly true. A little at a time, made sure the records were too messy to prove anything either way. The records, Clint said, moving a step closer, are going to show that the new cook couldn't keep track of the stores. Too big, too slow, too soft for the work. It happens. Women shouldn't be on the frontier, and this is just one more proof of that. He spread his hands, a gesture of regretful reason. You'll be gone by end of the month. I'll make sure you get your wages for what that's worth, and the matter of the missing supplies will be considered settled. And if I don't agree, then I take this to the ranch hands tonight and tell them I found it. His voice was very even. 40 men, Mrs. Holloway, 40 men who've been hearing for 3 weeks that something's not right with the new cook. You think any one of them is going to take your word over mine? She looked at him, at the gray-brown eyes that were flat and certain, and without the slightest doubt that this moment was already over and resolved in his favor. He had built this very carefully. He had taken his time, and he had the particular confidence of a man who has spent years watching people underestimate him, which was, she supposed, the one thing they had in common. "You've done this before," she said quietly. Not an accusation, an observation. Something flickered in his eyes. "Smart enough to notice that," he said, "not smart enough to have stayed out of the way." He took another step forward, and the space inside the spring house was not large, and he was between her and the door, and Beatrice understood with absolute clarity that Clint Rourke had not spent 20 minutes walking her out to a remote stone outbuilding to negotiate. He was going to take the lantern, and the ledger, if he could find it, and her composure, if he could manage that. And whatever was left after that, he would use to build whatever story served him best. He reached for the lantern. She swung it. Not wildly. She had not survived 41 years by doing things wildly. She swung it with the precise, controlled force of a woman who had been hauling iron pots across stone floors since before dawn for 5 weeks straight, whose arms were stronger than they looked, whose reflexes were sharpened by 20 years of managing dangerous stoves in close quarters. The lantern caught Clint on the side of the forearm with a crack that made him stagger back with a sound of pure shock. The sound a man makes when something he dismissed turns out to be real. She moved for the door in the same motion, shouldering past him before he recovered his balance, her hand finding the door handle and throwing it open into the gray afternoon light. She was through the door and 3 steps out before she heard him coming after her, and she ran. Not gracefully, not quickly by anyone's measure who believed speed was about how light you moved, but steadily and with the full-bodied determination of a woman who had made up her mind about a thing and was not going to be moved from it by anything short of the earth opening up. She cleared the brush line and hit the dirt track, and she was 20 yards up it when she heard another sound. Footsteps from the direction of the tree line, fast and certain. Not Clint's heavy boot fall. Lighter. Deliberate. Elias came out of the oak trees at a pace that ate the ground without appearing to hurry, and the expression on his face was the most emotion she had ever seen on it. Not anger, or not only anger, but the kind of focused intensity that lives on the other side of a very long patience finally running out. He had something under his arm. She saw it as he passed her. A leather satchel, dark with age and heavy with what sounded, when he moved, like paper. He moved past her and put himself between her and the spring house door. And Clint Rourke, who had emerged into the daylight with a bleeding forearm and a face full of fury, stopped dead at the sight of him. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. It had the quality of a very long time. "Thorne," Clint said. His voice had recovered its flatness. "This is none of your business." "It is, actually," Elias said. His voice was quiet. Absolutely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because it has everything else. "It's been my business for considerably longer than you'd like." He held up the satchel, and Clint's eyes went to it and stayed there. And what moved across the foreman's face then was not the controlled calculation Beatrice had been watching for 5 weeks. It was something rawer than that. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that the ground under his feet is not what he thought it was. "Sit down, Clint," Elias said, with the calm authority of a man giving an order he has no doubt will be obeyed. "We have a considerable amount to discuss." Clint didn't sit down. But he didn't move toward either of them either, and in that moment of stillness, in the gray Montana afternoon, with the wind moving through the fence-line oaks and the distant sound of cattle from the north pasture, something shifted at Black Ridge Ranch that no one present could have named precisely, but everyone present could feel. The trap had been set for the wrong person, and the wrong person had walked into it, looked at it clearly, and walked back out with a lantern and her dignity and 3 copies of her records intact, and whatever came next, she had already won the only part that could not be taken from her. She stood on the dirt track and caught her breath and watched Elias Thorne hold a leather satchel up to a corrupt foreman's frozen stare, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing I couldn't see the shape of. She still didn't know the full shape of it, but she was beginning to. They walked back to the ranch in a silence that was nothing like the comfortable silences Beatrice had grown accustomed to sharing with Elias Thorne. This one had texture to it, something dense and unresolved, like weather that hadn't decided yet what it intended to become. Clint walked ahead of them because Elias had made it quietly clear that he would be walking where Elias could see him, and Clint, stripped of the particular confidence that came from believing he held every advantage, complied with the sullen obedience of a man conserving his remaining options. Beatrice walked beside Elias and said nothing. She had questions. She had a great many questions, and they were stacking up behind her teeth with considerable pressure, but she had learned to read the timing of things, and the timing of this was not yet right. The satchel was under Elias's arm. Clint's forearm was wrapped in a bandana he'd produced from his pocket. The afternoon light was going thin and cold, and the wind had picked up, and the cattle in the north pasture moved like a slow dark tide against the gray grass. She watched Elias's face in profile and thought, I've been sitting across a table from this man every evening for 5 weeks, and I still don't know who he is. That thought, more than anything that had happened in the spring house, was the one that made her heart beat differently. They reached the main yard as the last light was leaving the sky, and Elias brought Clint to the foreman's office, a small room off the main barn that smelled of leather oil and old tobacco. And he set the satchel on the desk and opened it, and what he spread across the scarred wood surface, under the light of the oil lamp, was not a revelation so much as a reckoning. Ledgers. A dozen of them, at least. Thin notebooks and bound accounts and folded paper records going back 4 years, filled with figures in a hand so precise and deliberate it looked almost printed. Supply orders, expense accounts, payroll records, cattle sale figures, and beside each legitimate entry, a second figure, smaller, noted in a different column, that represented the difference between what was recorded and what was real. 4 years of quiet, methodical theft. 4 years of Black Ridge Ranch being drained from the inside by the man trusted to run it, in amounts small enough each time to pass beneath the notice of anyone who wasn't keeping very careful records. Beatrice looked at the figures and then looked at Clint, who had sat down in the chair behind the desk. His chair, the chair he had occupied for 4 years, and whose face had gone to a kind of gray stillness that she recognized as the particular expression of a man who has been watching a door close on him for some time and has now heard the latch fall. "How much?" she said quietly. It was the only question that needed asking right now. "Over 4 years," Elias said, "somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. He said it without drama, his voice carrying the same level tone with which he said everything, but his eyes on Clint were not level. They were the eyes of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now entirely done with being patient. $5,000. In 1882, on the Montana frontier, $5,000 was not a sum. It was a life. It was several lives. Clint moved then, not toward Elias, not toward Beatrice, but toward the door, in the fast sideways movement of a man making a calculation and deciding that motion was better than stillness. Elias was already there. He didn't raise his voice or his hands. He simply stood in the doorway with his feet shoulder-width apart and looked at Clint Rourke with an expression that communicated, more clearly than any threat, that this particular door was not available. "Sit down," he said, for the second time that afternoon. This time, Clint sat. What followed was an hour that Beatrice would remember in pieces rather than sequence. The way extreme events arrange themselves in memory, not as narrative, but as images, each one sharp and separate. Elias spreading the records. Clint's denials, which were at first loud and then quiet, and then entirely absent, because the records were not the kind of records you could argue with. Beatrice producing her own ledger, the original, from her coat lining, and laying it on the desk alongside Elias's accounts, where it fit like the last piece of a puzzle snapping into place. Here's what came in, here's what vanished, here's where it went. "You'll ride out tonight," Elias said when the arithmetic was beyond dispute. "You'll leave the payroll records, the deed documentation, and the ranch accounts. You'll leave your horse, which was bought on ranch funds, and take your personal gear." He paused. "If I find anything missing from this office tomorrow morning, I'll ride to the county sheriff myself." Clint looked at him across the desk, and his gray-brown eyes held something that was not quite defiance and not quite defeat. Something in between, something that was calculating even now, even in the ruins of his position, what leverage remained. "The men won't believe this," he said. "They've worked under me for years. You're nobody on this ranch. You're the man who eats last." "Yes," Elias said. "I am." And something in the way he said it, the absolute absence of apology or explanation, made Clint's eyes narrow and made Beatrice look at Elias with a sharpness she hadn't quite brought to bear on him before. "Get your things," Elias said. Clint got his things. He left before full dark, riding a borrowed horse from the public stable, and the hands who saw him go received no explanation that night. That would come tomorrow. Tonight, Elias watched him out of the gate from the fence line, and Beatrice stood beside him, and when the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the dark plain, the Montana night settled around them both with the particular weight of something finished. She waited. "You're going to tell me," she said finally. "Yes," he said. He was quiet for another moment, looking out at the dark where Clint had disappeared, and then he turned to face her with the expression of a man setting down a thing he has carried for a long time. "The ranch belongs to me," he said. "Has for 7 years. My father built it. He died 6 years ago, and I—" A pause. The first pause she had heard from him that felt like genuine difficulty, rather than the careful consideration of words. "I left. For 2 years I left, and I was not in a condition to manage anything." He said this with the flatness of someone who has decided the simplest truth is more respectful than ornament. "When I came back, the ranch was running. The men were working. Clint had kept the operation intact, and I—" Another pause. "I decided to watch, to understand what the place had become without me, and whether the people running it were worth trusting. I took a laborer's wage and a bunk with the other hands, and I watched." Beatrice was very still. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the dust. "How long?" she said. 3 years, he said. She thought about that. 3 years of eating last. 3 years of splitting firewood before sunrise and fixing other men's broken tools and being Elias, the quiet hand, the lowest man on the property. 3 years of watching a corrupt foreman drain the ranch that belonged to him, and watching and recording and waiting. "Why didn't you stop it sooner?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it. Only the genuine question of a woman who understood the arithmetic of patience but wanted to know his particular calculation. "Because I needed to know how far it went," he said, "and because—" He stopped, and for the first time since she had known him, Elias Thorne looked uncertain. Not the deep water kind of uncertain, but the surface kind, the kind that shows. "Because I needed to be certain I was ready to be what this place needs, and I wasn't sure I was. Not until recently." She looked at him for a long moment. At his face in the dark, the familiar angles of it, the steadiness that she had read without knowing it as the steadiness of a man with nothing to prove because he had already decided what he was. "The notebook," she said. "The one you carry." "Ranch accounts," he said. "The real ones." "And you've been watching the men, all of them." "Yes." "And me," she said. Not with bitterness, just with the quiet recognition of a thing that had been true all along without her knowing it. "Yes," he said again, and this time there was something different in the word, something that was not quite an apology, but was in the direction of one. "I watched you keep records when no one told you to. I watched you adjust the meals when the stores ran short without complaining to anyone about why. I watched you go to the spring house knowing it was a trap, because you'd done the math and knew that refusing was worse, and you went anyway with a lantern in your hand." He stopped. "I've watched a great many people on this ranch, Beatrice. I haven't watched anyone the way I watched you." The night was very quiet. Far away, a coyote said something to the dark, and the dark didn't answer. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." She nodded once, slowly, accepting this for what it was. True, and insufficient, and the best he had. It was more honesty than most people managed, and she had been alive long enough to know the difference between an excuse and an accounting. And this was an accounting. "Payday is Friday," she said, because the practical thing was always the next thing, and she had learned to use the practical thing as a bridge over the places that needed time. "The men need to know before then." "I know," he said. "I'll tell them in the morning." She nodded again and turned toward the cookhouse, and then she stopped, because there was one more thing that needed saying, and she had never been a woman who left important things unsaid when saying them was possible. "Elias." She turned back to face him in the dark. "Whatever you were, when you left, whatever condition you were in, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is the man who put a lock on my door and brought me dry wood and stood in a tree line for an hour in the cold because I asked him to." She held his gaze. "That's the man I know. The rest is your business." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the dim light from the bunkhouse windows, something in his face shifted into something she had not seen there before. Not the controlled steadiness, not the watchful calm, but something quieter and more vulnerable, something that had been lived in and was showing its wear. "Thank you," he said. Simply, without elaboration, which was the only way Elias Thorne ever said the things that mattered most. She went to her cabin. She unlocked her door with her brass key, which she did every night and intended to keep doing, because a locked door had nothing to do with distrust and everything to do with a woman's right to her own threshold. She sat on her bunk and looked at the 3 copies of her inventory records, the one in her coat, the one in her boot, the original in her ledger, and she thought about what it meant to have prepared for a war and found that the person fighting beside you had been better armed than either of you knew. Friday came with frost and a hard blue sky, and at morning meal, before the plates were cleared, Elias Thorne stood up at the end of the table that had always been Clint's end, and the cookhouse went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that comes when 40 people simultaneously sense that something has shifted in the world they are living in. He was not dramatic about it. He never was. He said his name, his full name, the name that was on the deed documents and the land records and the tax accounts going back to his father's time. And he said that Black Ridge Ranch was his and had been his. And he said what Clint Rourke had been doing for 4 years. And he set the ledgers on the table where anyone who wanted to could look. He said that Clint was gone and would not be returning, and that the payroll would be met in full on schedule, and that anyone who wished to raise a question or a concern about any of this should do so now or bring it to him directly. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. This one was the silence of 40 men doing a rapid and complicated recalculation of what they thought they knew, of what they'd been told, of who they'd been working for and who they'd been listening to, and what it meant that the man who had eaten last at their table and fixed their broken tools and said almost nothing for 3 years was the man who owned the ground under their feet. Decker, to his credit, was the one who spoke first because Decker was never at a loss for the wrong thing to say. He said, "You're telling us Elias has been the owner this whole time." "Yes," Elias said. "And Clint knew?" Clint suspected. Then Clint knew. That's when the accounting problem started. Another silence. Decker looked at his plate. Something moved on his face that might, if you were generous, have been the beginning of a reckoning with how he had spent the past 5 weeks. He looked at Beatrice, who was standing at the kitchen end of the room with a coffee pot in her hand and a perfectly composed expression on her face, and whatever he saw there made him look back at his plate again. "The cook's records," said a voice from the middle of the table. One of the younger hands, the one with the sunburned nose, who had told Beatrice that Elias always ate last. "They showed it? That the stores were being moved?" "They did," Elias said. "Mrs. Holloway kept records that none of us—" And here he paused, and the pause was deliberate, and it landed where he intended it to land. Had the foresight to keep. Without them, we would not have been able to prove what Clint was doing. Without them, the story he was telling about this kitchen would have been the only story available. He said it clearly and without ornament, in front of all 40 of them, and Beatrice kept her face composed and her grip steady on the coffee pot. But something behind her sternum did a thing that was warm and aching in equal measure. The questions that followed were practical and manageable. Wages, work arrangements, the question of a new foreman. And Elias answered them with the unhurried clarity of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for 3 years. By the time the coffee pot was empty and the plates were cleared, the cookhouse had a different quality to it. Not transformed. Transformation takes time, and old habits of thought are stubborn things, but altered, shifted fractionally in the direction of something better, the way a house settles differently after you've fixed the foundation. After the men had gone back to work, the cookhouse fell quiet. Beatrice was washing up, and Elias was standing at the kitchen end of the room with the empty coffee cup she'd refilled for him twice without being asked, and the morning light was coming through the east window in long, pale bars across the plank floor. "Foreman," she said, not looking up from the wash basin. "You'll need one." "I know." "Someone who knows the men, who the men will listen to." "I know," he said again. "Someone honest," she said, "who keeps records." The silence that followed had something in it that made her look up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was an expression she had not often had directed at her in her life. Not at her face, not at her body, not at the battered suitcase she'd arrived with, or the aching knees she never mentioned. It was the expression of a person being seen, fully, without the softening of illusion or the hardening of judgment, seen clearly and regarded with something that was both more careful and more certain than admiration. "I have someone in mind," he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked back at the wash basin because some things needed to be approached the way you approached a new fire, carefully, from a reasonable distance, until you understood how much heat it was putting out. "I need more butter," she said, "and coffee, and someone to fix the stone floor in here before my knees give out entirely." "I'll see to it," he said. "Today," she said. "Today," he agreed, and she could hear, without looking, that he was almost smiling in that way he had, small and private and genuine as anything she'd ever seen. She scrubbed the pan and the morning moved around them, solid and ordinary and full of the quiet work that constituted a life. And outside the cookhouse window, the Montana sky was hard and clear and going on forever, the way it always did out here, indifferent to small human dramas and vast ones alike. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, in the still ordinary morning that followed a night of reckoning, was that Clint Rourke had not, in fact, ridden far. He had ridden to the tree line at the edge of the property and stopped, and in the cold dark he had sat on his borrowed horse and done his own calculating. And what he had calculated was this, that he was leaving empty-handed and that certain documents in that satchel bore his name, and that a man with nothing to lose is capable of things a man with something to protect is not. He had turned his horse back toward the ranch in the deep hours of the night, and he had found a place to wait, and he was waiting still, patient in his own way, for the moment when the ranch was quiet and the opportunity he needed presented itself. The payroll strongbox sat in the ranch office. The deed document sat beside it. And Clint Rourke, who had spent 4 years becoming intimate with every shadow and creek and unlit corner of Black Ridge Ranch, knew exactly how to move through the dark when the time came. He did not intend to leave empty-handed twice. The ranch slept the way it always slept in the deep hours. Not quietly exactly, because a working ranch is never truly quiet, but with the particular rhythm of a place at rest, the low sounds of cattle shifting in the dark, the creak of wood contracting in the cold, the occasional movement of horses in the stable that meant nothing more than a horse adjusting its weight. Beatrice heard it anyway. She had always been a light sleeper. It was one of those qualities she'd developed not by choice, but by necessity. Over years of sleeping in places where the sounds around her required interpretation. A boarding house where the locks were unreliable. A railroad camp where the nights were restless with men who drank too much and thought too little. Her ears had learned to sort sound the way her eyes sorted light. This is nothing, this is something, this requires attention. What she heard at 2 a.m. on the Friday of payday was something. It was not loud. That was the thing about it. It was precisely not loud, which was itself a kind of sound. The sound of deliberate care being taken in the dark by something that didn't want to be heard. A footstep on frozen ground. The near-silent drag of a door that she knew from 5 weeks of mornings opened toward the left and had a particular catch at the top of its arc if you didn't lift the handle properly. The ranch office door. 30 yards from the cookhouse. In a normal night, she wouldn't have heard it at all. She lay still for 3 seconds, doing what she always did when the world presented her with a problem. She thought before she moved. Clint Rourke. It had to be. She had known, in the way she knew things, not by logic alone, but by the particular intelligence that lived in the body of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading the temperature of rooms and men, that his departure had been too clean, too fast, too easy. Men like Clint did not accept a loss. They absorbed it and looked for an angle, the way water finds the low place in a wall and keeps pressing until it finds the gap. The payroll strongbox, the deed documents. She had heard Elias mention both to the younger hands during the day's accounting, had heard him say they were secured in the ranch office, had watched him lock that office with the key he wore on a cord around his neck. She had also watched, from the cookhouse window, as Clint's departure had been hurried and incomplete. A man leaving things behind, she'd thought at the time, without fully understanding what she meant by it. She understood now. She rose from her bunk without lighting the lamp, because light would announce her before she was ready to be announced. She dressed in the dark, boots, coat, the heavy wool that kept out Montana cold, and she took the lantern from the shelf by the door and checked the reservoir without striking a flame. Full. She had filled it last night, as she filled it every night because a cookhouse required fire at 4 in the morning, and she had never once in her life been the kind of person who left that to chance. She stood at her cabin door with the cold lantern in her hand and thought, very quickly and very clearly, about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew Clint was in the ranch office, or heading there. She knew the office was on the far side of the barn from the bunkhouse. She knew Elias slept in the small room at the north end of the bunkhouse, the room that had always been the foreman's room and that he had quietly moved into after Clint left. Not because he wanted the foreman's privileges, but because the deed documents were closer there, and she suspected Elias Thorne had been sleeping lighter than usual since Wednesday night. She knew she could cross the yard to the bunkhouse and wake him, and that would take 4 minutes at minimum, and in 4 minutes a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and where it was kept could be gone. She thought about the cast-iron skillet on the kitchen hook, heavy, balanced, familiar in her hand after 5 weeks of morning use. She had picked it up and set it down 10,000 times. She knew its weight the way she knew her own. She unlocked her door and went to the cookhouse. The skillet came off its hook without a sound. She held it at her side, not raised, not threatening, just present, the way a fact is present, not requiring announcement. She crossed the cookhouse, went out the back door, and moved across the dark yard toward the barn. The office door was standing open 2 inches. A thread of light came through the gap. Not lamplight, but the thin silver of a dark lantern, the kind with a shutter you could narrow to a slit. Controlled. Careful. The light of a man who knew what he was doing. Beatrice stood outside the door and listened. The sounds from inside were focused and purposeful, the soft rattle of the strongbox being tested, the scratch of a pick or a key against the lock mechanism. Clint had planned this. He had not ridden away and changed his mind. He had ridden to the tree line and waited, and spent the intervening hours composing himself and his plan. And this was the plan. Come back in the dark, take the strongbox, take the deed documents, and ride for the territorial line before anyone knew what was missing. Without the deeds, the ranch's ownership would be in dispute. Without the payroll, 38 men would not be paid and would have 40 opinions about who was responsible for that. It was not an elegant plan, but it was a workable one, and it had the considerable advantage of not requiring anyone's cooperation. She pushed the door open and walked in. Clint was crouched behind the desk with the strongbox in his hands and the dark lantern on the floor beside him, and he came upright so fast that the strongbox hit the edge of the desk with a sound like a gunshot in the small room. His right hand went to his hip and then stopped because his holster was empty, and she remembered that Elias had required him to leave his ranch-issued sidearm with the rest of the ranch property when he left. And Clint's personal revolver, if he had one, was presumably with his personal gear, which was presumably wherever he'd tied his horse. He had not expected to need a weapon. He had expected to move in the dark and leave in the dark, and no one was supposed to be here, least of all her. They looked at each other across the width of the desk, and for a single suspended moment the room held its breath. Then Clint moved. He came around the desk fast, not toward the door, but toward her, because she was between him and the door, and the strongbox was still in his hands, and the calculation he was making was the same one he had made in the spring house, that she was a woman, and a large one, and that large women were slow and easily intimidated and could be moved aside by a determined man with something to lose. He had made this calculation before. He had been wrong before. He appeared to have retained nothing from the experience. Beatrice did not step back. She had thought about this in the seconds before she opened the door, and she had decided that stepping back was the one thing she would not do. Instead, she brought the skillet up, not in a wide swing, because wide swings were theatrical and inaccurate and left you unbalanced, but in a short, controlled arc that caught Clint's forearm, his right forearm, the same one she had hit with the lantern 2 days ago. And the sound he made was not theatrical either. It was entirely genuine. The sound of a man discovering that damaged tissue, struck in the same place twice, produces a pain that reorganizes all other priorities immediately. The strongbox hit the floor. Clint staggered into the desk and grabbed it with his left hand, breathing hard, his right arm held against his body, and he looked at her with an expression that had moved past calculation entirely into something rawer, something that was half fury and half the bewildered recognition of a man who has underestimated the same person twice in 3 days and is only now beginning to understand what that says about his judgment. "You're going to step aside," he said through his teeth. "No," she said. She kept the skillet up. Her arm was steady. I'm not. Beatrice. Her name in his mouth sounded wrong. Too familiar, reaching for a tone of reason he hadn't earned. You don't understand what you're getting in the middle of. This isn't about you. This is between me and Thorne, and it was between me and Thorne long before you arrived on this property. You can walk out of here and say you didn't see anything, and in the morning you'll still have your job and your kitchen, and nobody needs to— Mr. Rourke, she said, and her voice came out with a quiet precision that cut through his sentence the way a clean blade cuts. Without drama, without excesses, just exactly through the middle of the thing. I have been on this property for 5 weeks. I have been lied about, stolen from in front of my own ledger, lured to a remote building under false pretenses, accused in the hearing of 40 men of a crime you committed, and physically threatened twice by the same person. She held his gaze. You don't get to tell me what I'm in the middle of. I've been in the middle of it since September 8th. The room was very still. From somewhere outside, not far close enough, came the sound of boots on frozen ground, moving quickly. Clint heard it too. And what moved across his face then was the final calculation, the one at the bottom of the stack, the understanding that the margin had closed entirely, that the moment he'd been working toward had turned into its own opposite, and that the woman standing between him and the door with a cast-iron skillet and a perfectly level gaze had not only stopped him, but had held him here long enough for everything else to arrive. The office door opened. Elias came through it first, and 2 of the older ranch hands were behind him. Men who had clearly been pulled from sleep at speed and had come without asking too many questions because the man asking was the man who owned the ranch, and that was enough. Elias took in the room in a single sweep. Clint, the overturned strongbox on the floor. Beatrice standing on the far side of the desk with the skillet in her hand and her coat buttoned to the chin, and her expression carrying the calm of a woman who has already finished the fight she was in the middle of. His eyes went to Beatrice and stayed there for a moment that was brief and said a great deal. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. He looked at Clint. Clint looked back at him with the last remnants of a man who had once held every card and was now holding none. And the particular dignity with which he bore this was, Beatrice thought, the only thing she had ever seen in him that was genuinely his own. Not borrowed, not performed, just the final stripped-down fact of a man facing the end of his options. Tie his hands, Elias said to the men behind him. We ride to town at first light. He crossed the room and picked the strongbox up from the floor and set it on the desk, and then he looked at Beatrice again, and this time the look was different from any look she had received in her life. Not the appraisal she had spent 41 years preparing herself against, not the dismissal she had learned to walk through without breaking stride. Not even the careful regard she had grown accustomed to from him over the past 5 weeks. It was simpler than any of those. It was the look of a person who has watched another person do an extraordinary thing and wants to make sure the extraordinary person knows it was seen. You should have woken me, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. I thought about it, she said. I didn't have 4 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. You could have been hurt. I have a skillet, she said. Something crossed his face, something that started as exasperation and arrived after a short journey at something else entirely, something warm and certain and not even slightly hidden. Yes, he said. You do. They took Clint Rourke to the county seat at first light, Elias and 3 of the ranch hands, with the satchel of records and Beatrice's ledger copies, and the testimony of 2 witnesses who had arrived in the doorway in time to see the strongbox on the floor, and a man with bound hands explaining nothing. The sheriff was a thorough man with an appreciation for good record-keeping, and the records were very good. The matter did not take long to resolve, and what was resolved was everything. The theft, the fraudulent records, the conspiracy to remove a legitimate employee through false accusation. All of it, laid out in the clean arithmetic of 2 sets of ledgers kept carefully by people who believed that numbers were the most honest language available. Clint Rourke did not come back to Black Ridge Ranch. He did not come back to that county. What he came back to, in the years that followed, was his own reckoning, and that was between him and himself, and Beatrice Holloway had no further business with it. The weeks that followed were the quietest, most ordinary, and most profoundly altered weeks of Beatrice's time at Black Ridge Ranch, because ordinariness, after a long period of siege, has a quality to it that is almost indistinguishable from grace. The floor of the cookhouse was re-leveled by two men Elias assigned to the task on the morning after his return from town, and the sound of that work, the scrape of stone on stone, the level being checked and rechecked, was one of the best sounds Beatrice had ever heard. Her knees, which had been conducting a sustained protest for 5 weeks, registered their appreciation. New butter came from the supply house. New coffee. A second work table for the kitchen, broader and sturdier than the first, positioned at the right height for a woman of her particular dimensions to work without straining. Elias did not make announcements about any of these things. They simply appeared. The way the lock had appeared, the way the kindling had appeared, as evidence of a man paying attention and responding to what he saw. The ranch hands came to the cookhouse differently after that Friday. Not dramatically, not with apologies delivered in speeches, because these were frontier men and speech-making was not in their vocabulary, but in the small accumulated ways that constitute a change in the temperature of a place. Plates carried to the basin without being asked, a thank you offered with breakfast, then another, then a third, until it became unremarkable. Decker, who had never been a small enough man to apologize directly, began arriving early to breakfast and eating quietly, which was, from Decker, a significant concession. The young hand with the sunburned nose, his name was Casey, she'd learned, started lingering after supper to help with the washing up. Not because anyone asked him, but because, he explained, with the straightforward logic of someone who has recently revised his understanding of a situation, it seemed like the right thing to do. "You don't have to," she told him the first time. "I know," he said, and picked up a drying cloth. And that was the end of that conversation. Elias took the deed documents out of the strongbox one evening in October, when the first real snow had come, and the cookhouse was warm and lamplit and smelled of the venison stew she'd been developing slowly over the afternoon. He spread them on the work table. She was making pastry, and he waited for her to finish before he put anything down, because he had always known how to share a workspace without taking it over. And he showed her what was on the papers: the ranch, the acreage, the water rights and the grazing contracts and the timber claims. All of it, substantial and real, the foundation of something that had survived a long period of damage and was now being assessed with clear eyes by the man who owned it. "I want to change how things run," he said. She kept working the dough. "Tell me." "The men eat together, all of them. Same table, same time." He said it the way he said important things, without decoration, because decoration implied the thing needed help standing up, and this thing stood up on its own. No order, no rank at the table. "They've been eating together already," she pointed out. "Without someone eating after," he said. "Without someone waiting to see what's left." She looked at him. "That was your choice," she said. "No one made you eat last." "No," he agreed. "It was a choice I made for reasons that made sense at the time. I won't be making it anymore." She nodded and went back to the pastry and let a moment of comfortable silence do the work that words didn't need to do. Then she said, "The ranch house." He was quiet. "It's been dark since I got here," she said. Shuttered up. "The men talk about it in the way people talk about something they've decided not to ask about." "I know," he said. "What happened?" she asked, and it was the most direct question she had ever put to him, because she had earned the right to it, and she knew it, and so did he. Another pause. This one held the particular weight of a door that has been closed for a long time and is being opened carefully to see whether the air inside is still breathable. "My wife," he said. "She died in that house. 4 years before my father. I left because I couldn't. I found I was not able to be in a place that held that much loss without losing myself as well." He said it with the plain precision of a man who has been over the ground so many times he knows every stone. "I was not well for those 2 years. I'm aware of what that cost." "And now?" she said. "Now," he said, "I think a house is only as dark as the people in it allow it to be." She finished the pastry and set it to rest under a cloth. She washed her hands. She thought about what he was saying and what he was not saying, and she thought about her own house in Ohio, the one she'd lost, the one that had held 19 years of a life that had not been easy but had been hers. And what it meant to decide to inhabit a place again after loss had made it uninhabitable. "It'll need airing," she said, probably new curtains. Definitely a thorough cleaning, given how long it's been closed. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know. the one that was not quite smiling, that lived just at the edge of something open and certain and warm. "Is that an offer?" he said. "It's an observation," she said. "What you do with it is your business." "Beatrice." He said her name the way he'd said it that first night in the dark yard, careful, with the full weight of someone who understood what it meant to be given a name to keep. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. You know that by now." "Yes," she said, "I do." "Then I'll say this plainly, because I've learned that plain serves better than careful, at least between two people who have already seen each other at their least ceremonial." He held her gaze without flinching. "I watched you arrive on this ranch with a battered suitcase and aching knees and walk into a kitchen that was designed to defeat you, and I watched you defeat it instead. I watched you keep records no one asked you to keep and feed a man everyone else let go hungry, and go to a trap with a lantern in your hand because you'd done the math, and that was the best available move." A pause. "I have been watching people on this property for 3 years, and I have not, in 3 years, watched anyone the way I have watched you. I would like, with your permission, to stop watching you from a distance." The cookhouse was very warm. Outside, the Montana snow came down in the particular silence that snow makes when it falls heavily, covering everything. "You'll need to speak to me about the curtains," she said. "I have opinions about curtains." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and this time he did smile, fully, without restraint, the smile of a man who has carried a long weight and set it down in the right place at last. They opened the ranch house in November, and they did it without ceremony, because neither of them was a person who required ceremony for the things that mattered. They aired the rooms and beat the rugs and replaced the curtains with ones that Beatrice selected from the dry goods catalog with the same careful decisiveness she brought to everything. And Elias built fires in the fireplaces and let the warmth move through the rooms until the darkness that had lived in them for 4 years finally had nowhere left to stand. The men ate together. Every morning, every noon, every evening, 40 hands at a long table, and Elias at the end of it that had always been the foreman's end, and Beatrice moving between the kitchen and the table with the ease of a woman who has learned exactly what her kitchen can do and has made peace with its limitations and possibilities both. Casey helped with the washing up. Decker, over the course of December, became almost tolerable. The young ranch hand who had once said you do the math about the missing supplies became, by spring, one of the most reliably respectful people at the table, with the particular earnestness of someone who has understood something late and is making up for it with interest. Beatrice and Elias were married in February in the parlor of the ranch house, with the snow outside and the fire inside, and 38 witnesses who had at one point or another underestimated at least one of them. It was a quiet ceremony. They had both had enough noise. What Black Ridge Ranch became, in the years after that winter, was not the largest operation in Montana Territory, though it grew. It was not the wealthiest, though the accounts, kept now in 2 sets of parallel ledgers, cross-referenced and initialed and dated with the same meticulous care that had begun on a September afternoon with a new cook in an empty pantry, were clean and sound and showed, year after year, the steady growth of something well-managed and honestly run. What it became was something harder to put in a ledger, but no less real for that. It became a place where the men who worked it knew that their wages would come on time and their concerns would be heard and the food would be hot and plentiful and made with care, because the woman who made it believed, with a conviction that had been tested and had held, that the act of feeding people well was not a small thing. It became a place where no one sat waiting for what was left. It became a place where the quality of a person's work was the only measure that mattered, and the people who knew this first and had known it longest were a quiet man who had spent 3 years watching from the edges and a full-figured widow who had arrived with a battered suitcase and made the world of that ranch simply and irrevocably better. Travelers who passed through the territory and stopped at Black Ridge sometimes asked about the place, why it felt different from other ranches, what it was that made the men there carry themselves with a particular kind of ease, what made the cook's table the thing everyone talked about in the next town over. The answers they got were usually incomplete because the full answer required knowing the whole story, and most people only had time for part of it. But sometimes, if they asked the right person, if they asked Casey, who had grown from a sunburned boy into a capable young man, or if they asked one of the older hands who had been there from the beginning, they got something closer to the truth. There was a woman The story usually started, which was true of many stories and did not always mean what it meant here. Came in September of 82. Nobody thought she'd last the month. And then the person telling it would pause. In the way people pause before the part of the story that still surprises them, even after years of knowing it. Turned out, they'd say, she was the one holding the whole place together. Turned out she was the one who saw it all coming and kept records and stood in the dark with a skillet when it mattered most. Another pause. She's still there. Both of them are. You ride up to that ranch house any evening around supper time, the lights on in every window. And it was. Every window. The dark that had lived in that house for 4 years had been replaced, room by room and season by season, by something that had no more elegant name than this. People who had chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to stay. The Montana frontier was not a gentle place. It did not become one. But Black Ridge Ranch, in the years that followed that winter, became a place where a person could arrive with a battered suitcase and aching knees and no one waiting for them on the other side, and find, if they were honest and careful and not in the habit of waiting for permission to do the right thing, that they had come exactly far enough.